Hello and welcome to our next episode of Power Tools from Workbench Energy. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about a different grid service called demand response. We're excited to give some background on what that is, what it means to the grid, what it looks like in Ontario, and also share some opinions of where we think it's going. I'm excited because joining me today are two of the smartest people I know about this and many other topics, which makes this exciting. First, we have Allison from NLX. Allison manages market participation across several North American markets for NLX, and so brings a broader perspective than just Ontario and is certainly an expert in the topic today. Heather Sears is my colleague at Workbench Energy. She knows basically everything about everything that has to do with Ontario energy markets. And so if you ever have a question, she's who I go to about that. So super excited to have both of them on. Welcome, Allison and Heather.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Quite a flattering intro.
Let's. My pleasure. It's true. So why don't we get started today with, we're going to talk about demand response. So let's just start with, what is demand response? What are we talking about here? Allison, you want to lay the groundwork for the discussion today?
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Aaron. So the demand response has really evolved throughout the years, but the core need for it evolved from utilities and grid operators identifying a gap in their, tools in their tool belt where they didn't have another product to rely upon when the grid was facing stress and there was times of emergency. So when demand might be anticipated to be super high in a certain grid territory, and supply might not be sufficient to supply that, the utility will call upon a demand response participants. So any participant that has a controllable load to reduce that load and thus bring down the demand so supply can adequately meet the needs of the grid at that time. So it really tries to avoid emergencies on the grid, avoid blackouts, brownouts, things like that, that really cause stress to the grid by giving them a lever to move that demand around, where typically, historically, utilities and grid operators only had the ability to really control the supply side of that equation. So it's just really trying to balance out that equation. And sites that are able to kind of provide that is really anyone that has the ability to control that load. So it might be someone that's turning something off at the site and reducing their consumption, or someone with a behind the meter resource that they can transfer power to. Anything like that would really reduce their consumption from the grid is how they kind of provide that service and stability to the grid when the utilities need to call upon it. So we've definitely seen an evolution of that. It kind of started very simplistically in terms of demand response with more kind of manual curtailments and manual adjustments, but it's definitely gotten more sophisticated with some automation and some more better communication between the utility and demand response providers, which we can get into a bit later. But at its core, that's really what demand response is there for, is to alleviate those situations on the grid.
Very interesting. So Heather, I guess from your perspective, your experience, who do you, Allison's laid that out, right? This is the product. It's balancing that supply demand equation, as she said, but not on the supply side, but on the demand side. And in your experience, where do you typically see, I guess, the types of participants on the demand side? Where is that coming from, generally speaking?
Thanks, Aaron. Okay, so demand response really looks like specific facilities that are, as Allison said, able to reduce the amount of electricity they're using that's coming from the electricity system. So there are multiple different ways that facilities can reduce their load and different types of facilities that can do it. So you can have a large industrial facility that's making something. They could be making widgets or cement or steel or whatever the case may be. They have a lot of processes that are happening at their site, and all those processes are using electricity. So to reduce the amount of electricity they use, they can stop or curtail or reduce what some of those processes are doing, when the supply of electricity to the grid or to their system is tight. Alternatively, there are facilities who are so busy making their widgets that they can't possibly or don't want to, or it's very expensive to shut down production. So instead, they'll have something at their facility that can supply electricity when the grid can't supply that electricity. So from the perspective of the grid, it looks like a reduction in the amount of electricity that's being used from the system. But what it actually is a generator at that industrial facility that is generating the electricity to make up for what's not coming from the grid. So generation facilities at large commercial or industrial plants can provide that service, as can electricity storage. You can have a battery or a series of batteries at a site that are able to turn on very quickly and displace the electricity load at the site. So it's no longer coming from the grid. It's just coming from that battery system. So all across North America, and certainly in Ontario, we have a lot of large commercial and industrial facilities and some smaller commercial and industrial facilities that have this flexibility with their resources, either to turn down or turn off processes or to provide an alternative electricity source at their site to reduce what they're pulling from the grid. And that capability has value to the grid, because when there is a tightness in that supply and demand balance, when the grid operator has utilized all of the resources, all of the generation resources, or most of the generation resources that are available, or there's a contingency, something goes out, a transmission line or a generator goes out, suddenly the need to supply that demand becomes urgent, and there just may not be enough grid capacity to meet all of the demand across the region. And so by turning on these resources behind the facility, or by reducing the amount of electricity that's coming off of the grid by curtailing some production activities, they're able to provide that demand response, responding with their demand as a product to the grid.
Got it. Okay, so we now know what it is. We know what people are doing. They're either reducing their demand, they have a generator or battery or something that they turn on, so it makes it to the grid. It looks like their demand reduces. This is another resource, as Allison said, in the toolkit for the grid operator, who can, when they need to make that supply-demand balance happen. So what's the frequency here? And now, not just here in Ontario necessarily, but Allison, you cover a bunch of markets. If someone's participating, is this a daily thing that they're now going to reduce? Is it infrequent? What's the norm, or does it vary significantly jurisdiction to jurisdiction?
Yeah, it definitely varies. There's a lot of flavors of demand response and demand response programs across the different markets in North America, and the frequency does vary. Right. So you might have a program that is compensated at, the product is more valuable. A certain utility or grid operator might need that demand reduction more frequently than, another market. So they might compensate these sites participating at a higher rate. But generally speaking, across the board, it is not a super frequent occurrence where this will have to happen. If the site is participating, say your manufacturing site, this doesn't mean, typically that every other day you won't be able to manufacture your widget. It really is used, as Heather said, kind of as that one of the last resorts, or one of the last pieces in a series of actions that a grid operator will take to ensure that there's that balancing of supply and demand. So we've only seen, in Ontario, for example, a few instances of true emergency situations where that load has to come down and that demand response, group has to be activated. But a lot of the programs do like to test that resource type, right? They want to make sure that all the sites participating in these programs are able to do what they're saying, right? Because so much of the year they don't have to respond and they don't have to demonstrate that. So typically you'll find in a lot of programs that there are some tests that occur throughout the year, but that's generally only one or two times a year to test that as well.
All right, so infrequent, regular tests, but infrequent activations for
activations.
the immediate emergency need on the grid. So, okay, now here's the criticism that anyone who's participated will have heard about demand response. Why is the grid operator paying money to people to participate if they almost never get called? If they get called once a year or even more infrequently than that, why would we bother paying it? Are they just wasting money paying for people to be ready, for facilities, I should say, to be ready to reduce? Heather, Allison, what do you say to those who say that this is a unnecessary program that wastes money?
Well, let me start and be as generous as I can on this one. I think that just the nature of running a reliable electricity system means you need to have sufficient capacity in whatever formats it's available to meet the peak demand requirements of a grid. And that means paying for whether it's generation resources that aren't generating but are available to stand by when the grid needs them, or paying for demand response resources that may not be required every day but are available when the grid needs them. That's part of the insurance that a grid has reliable supply to meet what the demand needs are. It's a contingency product, and just like we pay for our own insurance, we may not need it, but it's there if we do. Allison, do you have anything to add?
No, I would definitely agree. And I think a good example that I've heard and a good way to think about it is, airlines, for example, on really peak holiday travel times. Sometimes they overbook, right? There's so much demand for tickets to fly on those airplanes that they will pay you not to take that flight, right? They'll say, can you take a later flight? Can you travel at a later time? Airlines could have a fleet of 100 jets waiting by, right, to do that. But that would be a lot more expensive and a lot more, resource intensive to have those jets standing by just to use them that once a year. So why not instead use that resource that you already have in the ground, people, right, to not do that? So you already have the plants there. You already have the loads that are existing. So why not use that existing resource to help meet that need versus, building a whole new power plant or, buying that fleet of jets when you're not going to use them for, maybe 364 days of the year. So in that sense, it's actually a pretty economic and practical use of this resource.
That's a really timely example. I like that a lot. I think another way we can think about it as well is that because demand response is individual facilities across a region, they are able to provide more regional demand support if necessary. So if there's a constraint in a particular area, that can be met with a demand response in a particular area rather than a global new facility that needs to be developed for those occasional issues that may be in an area a little further away.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I think one of the other pieces, especially when we talk about the electricity system, is to keep in mind how incredibly reliable we expect it to be, right? And so when you look, and I'm going to get out of my depth here, and if grid operators listening to this, they're going to shake their head, but there's a standard that the grid operators across North America essentially design the reliability to, and it's this concept of how often should there be a loss of load? How often can we accept the grid would go down and we would have a loss of load? And I can't remember the exact name of it, but the concept is that once every 10 years, I think is the standard that they designed for, that there would be 1 day loss of load every 10 years, is what I seem to recall. And that's at the bulk system, so that would be the entire sort of a large area losing load for a day. That's really reliable. That's very infrequent problems, which means they have to, when they're planning, look at those odd events where not only is it a near or record-breaking heat wave where it's we're 2 weeks into a heat wave and demand is at its absolute peak, but we also maybe have a few generators that have broken down because who knows, right? That happens. And so once every 10 years or once every few years, the grid operator can find themselves in that position where essentially everything that could push the system to its brink is, and that's where we want this resource. And to get that level of reliability, to Allison's point, we could build extra plants that sit there and do nothing for a year or 2 years. But in order to make sure we can meet those peak moments, we need these other, we need that power supply or that ability to balance. And we've seen that recently more often happening, right? Of course, Texas, right? We heard about the issues in Texas a year or two ago. I was just reading about Australia had a major heat wave and was having huge issues maintaining the stability of their grid just recently, a month or two ago. So when I think about it, that you have to keep in mind how reliable we all expect it to be, and that's what the grid operators are solving for. Right? It'd be a lot easier if they could just let the grid go down once a month and let that be, but that's not the expectation we all have.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think specifically in Ontario, which is really the only thing I know about, the amount of electricity that we use in Ontario varies widely. We use twice as much electricity in the middle of the summer on a hot day with all of our air conditioning load than we do that same day at 2 o'clock in the morning when the lights are off and AC is low and windows are open. And so really we have to build a system to meet that highest possible amount of electricity consumption on the highest temperature day with all the humidity and all the air conditioning running in the entire province of Ontario. And that varies. And we've seen a lot of variation in weather patterns over the last couple of years, which really makes it difficult to plan and know what is going to be needed on a real-time basis. And so these emergency energy conditions can be as simple as an unexpected loss of a facility, a significant increase in electricity demand because of sustained hot temperatures, or really a transmission line going down. Anything like that means we don't have the ability to get a new generator online because there isn't one, and we need some sort of relief.
Okay, so that's a great transition there, Heather. So far we've talked mostly broadly, what is the product, why is it there, why do grid operators have it, who participates. So let's zoom in now on the Ontario market more specifically. A little bit of context there. DR has been around now in Ontario. I don't know the exact date, but it's probably about a decade or so. The program has evolved many times, and what that means is the specific requirements for participating has changed over the years. We've had different programs from DR3 programs to a demand response auction. Now the product is fully competing in the ISO's capacity auction on an annual basis with many other resources. And that evolution in Ontario has mirrored, I think, Allison, you touched on the evolution that continues to go on in other jurisdictions. But having said that, recognizing that it's changed over time, who wants to tell us, okay, in Ontario, if you're a DR demand response participant, what does that mean? What do you have? What are your obligations? What are the expectations? What does that program now mean? Not in the past, but the current iteration of it as it stands today.
So in Ontario today, with the new structure, the structure that's in place right now, with the capacity auction, demand response participates, in competition with many other resources in these programs. So in order to enable participation in demand response, first you'll have to, secure that commitment, secure that essentially commitment to the grid operator, the IESO, saying, I want to provide that demand response. I want to get compensated as such, and I will show up and be reliable when the grid operator calls me to do so. So in order to do that, you have to participate in an annual auction, which will set the price for that next year. So that really dictates over the following year how much of your load you need to reduce in the program, and then how much you'll get compensated for that. So those are kind of the two key pieces. And then once you've locked that in, you'll have a year of, an obligation period where you will have to commit and say, okay, I will be available during the program hours, which range from, range seasonally. So in the summer, the ISO expects demand response resources to show up between 12 p.m. and 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's a trick there. The ISO always likes to follow their Eastern Standard. They don't follow the daylight savings. So it's also 1 to 10 p.m. with daylight savings, and then 4 to 9 p.m. In the winter months. And the reason for that differentiation, as Heather said, is, the load varies. They need more of that demand response load reduction in the summer months. If you have to be available to do that curtailment, that megawatt that you were assigned for those hours throughout, the summer and winter months. And then you will be compensated for just being available, saying, if I'm called, I will reduce. Now, as we mentioned earlier, it's very rare or very infrequent when you will be asked to actually do that load reduction, right? Hopefully the grid doesn't get to a point where it needs that emergency resource at that point. But the grid operator, the ISO, will test that resource. So folks that are participating can expect to get called to do a test with that load reduction up to twice per season, so up to 4 times per year. Just to demonstrate, okay, I can, drop this load just to make sure that product is available in the time of an emergency. So that's, roughly the number of dispatches or events that a participant can expect in a year of the program participation.
Great, thanks for that. And so, Heather, not that I'm going to expect you to quote the exact numbers off the top of your head, but here in Ontario, Alison said that demand response participates now in this capacity auction, and then that sets the price. So can you give us a sense, what is that price? What's the value, and what's the size? Approximately how big are the capacity auctions these days, and how much of that is demand response? No, you don't have to do it down to the dollar or the megawatt, but roughly speaking, what are we looking at?
Roughly speaking, so only the last 2 capacity auctions in December of 2020 and December of 2021, which were for the last two years, was demand response procured under a full capacity auction, so competing with other resource types to provide the capacity to the ISO. And so only a subset of the capacity procured in those last 2 auctions is actually applicable to demand response. I don't know the breakdown, but it's a large proportion of that. The period that we're in right now, the summer of 2022, the demand response that is active in this period was procured from the December 2021 auction. The ISO had set a target for that auction to procure 800 megawatts, I believe it was, or 1,000 megawatts of capacity for the summer, and actually procured about 1,200 megawatts of capacity for the summer. The winter requirement was lower. They set a target to procure 500 megawatts of winter capacity and procured a little bit above that, about 800 megawatts. And then looking into the next period, I think the targets have increased a little bit. It's still a competition between demand response and other off-contract capacity resources, but those targets will increase a bit. So we're looking at 500 to 1,000 megawatts of curtailable capacity, whether it's behind the meter generation or storage resource supporting the displacement of load or actual curtailment of load across Ontario. And price-wise, that varies as well because this product is procured in an auction. Participants really are identifying to the ISO how much they need to receive as a standby payment to make this load curtailment worthwhile. I mean, they're losing production costs, or they're losing production, and so that has a cost associated with it. And standing by to be able to reduce that consumption has a cost. And so those bids for the summer piece and for the winter piece are stacked by the ISO. They solve for what their capacity targets are and come up with a price. So the value does vary year over year. Typically, the summer capacity is of a higher value to the ISO. They procure more of it, and the cost is a little bit higher. Winter, the last 2 years, has been a lower need by the ISO and therefore a lower price. But a single megawatt that is available year-round The value of that is between $40,000 and $50,000 per megawatt year. Again, varies year over year, varies depending on what the ISO needs are and who's participating, but that's approximately the range we're looking at. I think another point to bring up here is this capacity that the ISO is procuring from demand response is a business day only capacity. So for the summer season, as Allison said, they're looking for resources' ability to reduce their load between noon and 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time only on business days. So it's a Monday to Friday product. And so, weekends just typically because the ISO demand needs are a little bit lower on the weekend. And so it does fit well with some commercial and industrial facilities whose electricity usage is higher during those business days.
All right, one more nitty-gritty detail question here, maybe Heather, around for folks who are interested in the program, maybe been following it. The ISO sometimes talks about virtual and physical DR resources. What is that? What does that mean?
I love this one. Okay. So really, the ISO allows participation in the demand response program for not only facilities that get their electricity from the ISO, so transmission connected direct market participants. They also allow it from facilities who they don't interact with typically, so who buy their electricity from a local distribution company. So where the ISO is already the provider of electricity to a particular facility, that facility is considered a physical resource for ISO purposes. They see the meter data, they can see what the facility is doing. They can treat that one a little bit differently just in terms of the collection of data and validation of performance. Resources that the ISO cannot see that are embedded behind a Toronto Hydro or a Hydro One or an Electra Utilities, ISO doesn't see what they're doing in real time. There's a different sort of process for the collection of meter data and validation that a resource has performed. So those facilities ISO considers to be virtual facilities. They can't see them. They know they're out there, but they're in some sort of mystery cloud until after the fact when they collect the data and can see what happens. And so the ISO allows as well a collection of resources into a particular pool, an aggregated pool. That aggregated pool would be considered a virtual resource typically because it may have some physical, some virtual, a bunch of different resources sort of added together to provide one curtailment product essentially of the addition of all of their load reductions. And that typically would be a virtual resource. So generally, virtual means ISO can't see you until later. Physical means ISO can see you now.
Got it. That is confusing because they're both physically factories, they're both physically a device, but I guess it's from the ISO's perspective, the use of that word. So that touches on a really interesting, you touched on something interesting, I think a really important point here, which is, Allison, you talked about the act of getting the obligation going through the auction. Heather, you talked about there's different types of resources, physical versus virtual, and then virtual can be an aggregation of different resources. And so up to now, we've been talking about it as though a factory, organization, a company goes to the ISO, they work themselves through the auction, they get the obligation, and then they manage that obligation over the course of the period. That is an option. Some of our customers, usually larger load customers, multi-megawatt kind of customers, will work with in that way, where they get directly the obligation from the ISO. That's not the most common way, certainly, of participating, and it really does require a fairly large customer before that becomes a feasible route. And the more common route is through that aggregation that Heather touched on. And Allison, I know that's a big part of what you do at NL is that aggregation and bringing those pools of resources together. So can you explain a little bit more what does that mean to aggregate those resources together? What does that do? Does that change what it seems like for the participant when they participate in this program? And does it change their obligations in any way?
Yeah, love to dive into that one. I think really what the aggregation does at a very simple level is just enable that participation and make it easier to receive the benefits of participating without having to kind of go through a lot of the hoops to get there. And there's also a few constraints that the ISO has put on the program itself where, as Erin said, a lot as we've been talking about it up till now, we're talking about, one manufacturing plant going to the ISO and getting that obligation. Well, the minimum kind of load reduction amount to be able to do that is a megawatt at this point, which is a pretty significant load reduction, right? So we have a lot of customers that, just aren't quite there and might, reduce only 100 kW in one of these events, but that's still really valuable, especially when you put together 200 of those customers that can do a little bit. So it's really a way, one, for the customer to be able to participate. Otherwise, they would not have been able to without, joining a part of this aggregated group to participate, and a way for the ISO to receive the benefits of these smaller customers without having to kind of keep track of all these meters, right? Because they might not have that line of sight because they're with a LDC, a load distribution company. So I think, some of the biggest rewards also for being in kind of that aggregated model is there's some protections in place, in terms of shielding from penalties and things like that can come from participating in this program, right? The ISO needs to ensure that this product is showing up, and if for some reason it doesn't, there are repercussions for that. So it's a way to kind of shield them from that and also make that participation easier. They don't have to think about, I have to go, sign up for the auction, participate in the auction. NLX or whatever company is that aggregator would do that for them, and then just say, okay, you have an obligation for this next year for 100 kW, and when we tell you to turn off or curtail. So in terms of participating, the number of dispatches is the same, and all of that, and the load reduction piece is the same. It's just kind of all the things in between and getting there and accessing that participation is what that kind of aggregation allows for.
So I want to then shortly, I want to turn to where we think this program is going to evolve here in Ontario. But just before we get there, there's one more Ontario-specific thing to discuss in the context of demand response, which is the ICI program, the Top 5 Peak program, which is near and dear to my heart. Certainly, those are large industrial loads who reduce demand on peak days to avoid the charges associated with those peak demand hours. Heather, how is demand response different from ICI?
That is an excellent question, and one that does come up quite a bit. The ICI program, the Industrial Conservation Initiative program, is not a product. It's not an administered program. It's a voluntary program for facilities that are eligible to save some costs. It's written into Ontario regulations, so the participation is, again, voluntary based on particular eligibility requirements. And really, it's about ensuring that facilities are, or really supporting grid reliability by reducing consumption for over top peak periods across the province, and that allows facilities to save some costs on the global adjustment line item on their bill. Again, it's voluntary. It's not a program that the ISO administers, and it's really a cost-saving measure. Demand response is different. Demand response is a reliability product that the ISO is procuring to manage grid contingency events or periods of tight supply. Sometimes the periods may correlate, right? There might be a period of time where the demand is high and it is one of the top peaks, and a facility will aim to curtail for cost savings. Maybe that would occur at the same time as the ISO has a grid contingency that requires or that activates demand response, but that it's not a direct correlation. A grid contingency or requirement for demand response can happen in any of the business hours over the year from which they procure the capacity. So it's not the same product at all. Sometimes it might be a megawatt that is used in both programs, but one is an ISO administered program for a capacity product that has availability requirements. The other is a voluntary cost reduction opportunity that many Ontario facilities use because it does have significant cost savings benefits. That's, I think, as generally as I can put it. What did I miss?
Made sense to me. Okay, so look, we're almost out of time here. So let's spend the last couple minutes. Let's hear from you guys. Where do you think demand response is going in Ontario? Either where do you think it's going, or where would you hope it's going? You can tell us if where you think it's going is different than your hopes and dreams, then let us know. But Allison, what's in the future for the demand response program here in Ontario?
I do wish I had a crystal ball and could know, and I hope it would align with what I would like. But I think we're at a really interesting time in Ontario right now, because we're expected to see a lot of demand growth in the province over the next decade, and there's going to be a real need for this capacity for this demand response product, especially as we're getting more renewables potentially in the mix, and especially so I think there's a huge opportunity, right? If there's a big capacity need in the province, this capacity auction, this demand response resource can be such a huge benefit and value add, and can really expand in terms of the number of megawatts that can be provided. I think in order to make that happen, there's definitely some changes to the structure of the program that would have to happen. I don't know if I can pick one thing, but I think generally is giving some security around, we said that we have these auction targets, making sure that we are giving some consistency around those so folks will want to participate, and maybe build a lot of these, more sophisticated demand response products, like maybe energy storage that is behind a load, or a backup generator, or, automate their building management system, something like that. Make that investment so they know that there kind of is certainty in the market moving forward, and then making sure that we haven't enabled all different resource types to participate in demand response, right? We have a lot of distributed solar, we have a lot of behind the meter batteries, like I said, and just making sure that we have the right models to optimize and use the resources that are there, I think would hopefully grow the demand response resource and add a lot of value to the grid in the future.
Those are great points. I'm going to add a few more from my wish list and my expectations. So in Ontario, the ISO publishes every year an annual planning outlook where they're looking at supply and demand forecasts out for the next, really deep focus on the next 10 years. And in the last two annual planning outlooks, we've seen an increase in expectation for demand, and to such an extent that we're now seeing a gap, and there's a piece of capacity that needs to be procured in the middle of this decade, and that need is going to grow. It's growing with electrification in a number of sectors, and it's growing with the reduction of the loss of some of our existing generation facilities that are expiring. So we're going to lose some supply at the same time as we're increasing demand. And so there are a lot of procurements from the ISO to seek that capacity, and to seek that capacity as quickly as is humanly possible, as quickly as we can get steel in the ground. In the meantime, we have demand response as a resource that is in the ground, is capable of responding, and can provide the very, very necessary capacity that we see, particularly in summer, in the next few years. But the design of the program is uncertain. There have been some proposed design changes to the capacity auction and the operation of resources that come out of the capacity auction that were proposed in a way that really were significantly negatively impacted really only the demand response resources. And so there was a lot of controversy, and there's still some uncertainty about where things will land, although we know that those changes are not coming up in the next year. I think we've got some work to do on helping the ISO understand how these resources operate, why they operate the way they operate, and what the specific value is that they can provide, so that we can ensure that rules changes that do come in the next few years are respectful of the value of demand response as a capacity resource. I think the need is going to increase. I'm hopeful that the ISO will acknowledge and value the resource for what it is, and we'll see a significant growth in that opportunity over the next few years. Beyond that, demand response becomes a balancing product for year-over-year changes from expectations. So, they'll have supply and demand, supply that's procured for the long term, and then as year over year, the changes are a little bit lower in between what the planning was 5 years ago or last summer versus what it is now, and demand response can fill that gap.
Okay, great. Well, look, I'll summarize what I heard there as there's a ton of potential for demand response. There's a huge need here in Ontario that's growing, it sounds like. Still some things to figure out, but I'm going to take that as positive. If there's a need and there's a resource capable of providing it, I think we're going to figure out a way to make that happen and make sure that it works. So look, we're out of time. I would love to spend more time picking your brains, having this opportunity to hear your thoughts on these sorts of things, but I do appreciate you taking the time, Allison and Heather, to join me today, talk about demand response, share your expertise. Really enjoyed it, and I'm sure others who get the opportunity to listen to you will also enjoy it, so thanks very much.